Thank you very much, Alistair. So here's my question, which I'm taking on. How is self-knowledge important to the communication of risk? In an illuminating lecture at the launch of the Centre for Personalised Medicine in November 2013, Professor Peter Donnelly jokingly remarked that the declining cost of DNA sequencing had made it possible to know thyself cheaply. Now, he attributed the adage, know thyself, to the Bible, suggesting that the biblical authors did not anticipate this use of their words. This, of course, would be true if the saying was biblical. But in fact, it's not. Self-knowledge is a major theme of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures and is developed in ways which distinctively shape human attitudes to God, the future, suffering, and bodily experience. But for the record, the saying is actually ancient Greek in its sources, most famously inscribed at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. And it's inspired much reflection down the years, including an emphasis especially on sober humility, that one ought not to boast that one is or knows more than one in fact is or does in fact know. And that's a quality which science at its best embodies, but hype can perhaps distort. So humility and self-knowledge is also a theme of Hebrew scriptures associated with loving fellowship with God. He has told you, O mortal, what is good and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. Now, a further piece of Hebrew wisdom, Psalm 139, gives more insight into the source of self-knowledge. For you created my inmost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, God. How vast is the sum of them. So for the psalmist, self-knowledge is distinctively theological. It depends on being known by God, coming into being through God, prenatal communion with God. And here's my son Luke. This was a picture which came to my mind when Sean was asking us what picture comes into our minds as to what matters to us. It wasn't quite this picture, it was a picture of him in the garden, I suppose, probably at home. But he's a bit bigger now. So prenatal communion with God, being sustained by the providence of God, trusting for the future, sustained by God. So the psalmist doesn't know himself except through God's knowledge in these domains. But people's self-knowledge is very diverse in a plural society. First, the psalmist is inconsistent in many parts of his own self-knowledge. But second, as I say, in a plural society, many do not and will not know themselves as the psalmist does. And that diversity presses on an issue germane to this session, how varieties of self-knowledge relate to perception of risk and behaviour change, how different forms of self-knowledge shape people's perception of probabilities regarding their future, well-being, and how they then respond. So, going on to this slide, the UK government's Chief Scientific Advisor's 2014 annual report concerned innovation and risk, and it found that improved communication about risk between specialists and the public could be partially achieved through engagement with the values, beliefs, and cultural commitments of the public, or rather the many publics which make up plural democratic societies. So engagement as an innovation itself are key roles it serves for the creative arts, humanities and civil society, and it encourages that there is scope for dialogue to be extended to the workplace, the neighbourhood centre, the household and the church. And theology, religion and philosophy alongside social sciences I think is very well placed to help with this engagement in public attitudes. So with that said, by way of introduction to self-knowledge, I want to make 4 remarks about self-knowledge. First, self-knowledge concerns motivation and action. So in March, the BMJ featured a systematic review and meta-analysis of studies examining behaviour change, diet, screening, exercise and so on, following the communication of DNA-based risk estimates. And the conditions which were covered were diabetes, heart disease, cancer of various sorts, and Alzheimer's, and obesity. And it found the following. Expectations that communicating DNA-based risk estimates changes behaviour are not supported by existing evidence. These results do not support use of genetic testing or the search for risk-conferring gene variants for common complex diseases on the basis that they motivate risk-reducing behaviour. Now, this paper is actually in line with many other studies in this area. It suggests that communication of DNA-based risk estimates makes no major difference to patients' behaviour. But nor does it paralyse patients with a sense of genetic fatalism about the future. Instead, such communication makes only a very slight difference, if any at all. It's got some acknowledged weaknesses, the research, the evidence they're drawing upon, but as I say, it broadly reaffirms what other studies have found. Now, these findings, I think, raise deeper questions about whether genetic knowledge should be called self-knowledge at all, really, when its ordinary effects on self-motivation are so slight. So 23andMe's Welcome to You, which Tim featured in his slide, seems even less plausible in this light. And even if self-knowledge is partially genetic, how much does it have to do with motivation and behaviour compared to other forms of self-knowledge? How is a person's self-knowledge formed by how I see my identity in relation to the future, what I value and believe, what I ought to do with whom and why? And how does all this relate to risk communication and behaviour change in personalised genomic medicine? So let's take up the point about self-knowledge and the future in more detail. Physician Peter Husser comments that an almost exclusively molecular and biological concept of personalisation leads to a strong connotation, if not a de facto identification, of person with the molecular setup of an individual's physical body. This is a pitfall which ought to be avoided. But what exactly is the pitfall? It concerns self-knowledge in some way, and to my mind it has a double depth. First, it reductively obscures or distracts attention from environmental and psychosocial dimensions of a person's healthcare. But second, this reductionism can slip into a fatalistic paralysis because of a deterministic interpretation of the genome. Perhaps using a blueprint or program metaphor of causation rather than a systems approach which considers all the influences, physiological and pathophysiological, at a whole organism level, let alone then the environmental and psychosocial factors which shape a person. We've got to ask, how big a threat is a reductionist and fatalist sense of self-knowledge? Well, perhaps not very great for clinicians and scientists. Genomics-based personalised medicine is self-consciously not typically about treating persons in their individuality, but rather as members of subgroups stratified according to a very narrow specification. And clinicians know that environmental and psychosocial dimensions of health are very important. So this could perhaps save them from tumbling into the reductionist fatalist pitfall. But there's always temptation, a tendency towards certain kinds of knowledge becoming dominant unduly over time, and for knowing and willing, crucially, to become unhinged. An interview study of German physicians in stratified medicine cites the worry that clinicians will become administrators of markers, that the art of healing and what is a person, what is the end of life, and so on, how to deal with illness, that this gets into the background. And this is if this is the case for physicians, how much more of a temptation would it be for employees of pharmaceutical, data trading and insurance companies, distanced from the disciplining experience of clinical encounter? What about patients? Fatalism about the future wasn't suggested by the BMJ study. Patients do not identify themselves with genetic predispositions, or at least not sufficiently to change their behaviour. On the other hand, it may be that a reductionist fatalist view of genetics remains highly influential. Further work would be needed. This brings us to a third element of self-knowledge. Self-knowledge, risk and values. Presentation of risk in terms of statistics may shape people's self-knowledge perhaps profoundly. Communicating risk in terms of the quantification of probabilities requires skill, and there is a very extensive literature out there, as people will know. From what I read, visual representations, pictographs, fact boxes, rather than or alongside bare numbers, are likely to be more effective in enabling better understanding even if not behaviour change. I think the behaviour change part is largely unproven. Similarly, absolute risk rather than relative risk is easier to grasp. But again, language and metaphor are also important. Consider again the difference between program and system. Mentioned earlier, in the context of predicting cancer risk, program may suggest the idea that I have a genetic fault, but system may suggest an elevated likelihood that the body under certain circumstances can get cancer. And these two ways of, these two metaphorical lenses over which through which we see the world may shape self-knowledge rather differently. The one perhaps indicating a kind of permanent black mark, the other as a kind of open question about the future, not blind to risk, but not fatalistic either. So more broadly, communication of risk concerns what people value and why, and especially how they regard the future. An example of this would be religious belief. Religious belief in many people's lived experience shows up in what they value and how they regard the future, which in turn shapes their interpretation of risk and their behaviour. How so? Well, in the psalm, self-knowledge is related to God's knowledge of the probability of any eventuality and continuing fellowship with God amidst any eventuality, and therefore perhaps an assurance or perseverance in wise living amidst adversity. But alternatively, some kind of religious belief might support fatalism, or even that genetic ill health is a kind of punishment from God. For example, some research around diabetes treatment in South Asian populations indicated that understanding religious beliefs about the origins of sickness may help in exploring resistance to screening and behaviour change. But religion's not all the same. There are differences within, for example, Islam, Christianity and Buddhism, and each involves quite different doctrines which shape self-knowledge. Jesus of Nazareth, for example, apparently rejected any association at all between wrongdoing and conditions suffered from birth. Moreover, certain beliefs benefiting from high-quality risk communication may galvanise behaviour change, or simply enable living with risk but without fear, perhaps through knowledge that one's days are in God's hands, as Psalm 139 suggests. Of course, as I've emphasised, self-understanding is not simply religious. Engaging with the plurality of belief and self-knowledge, religious or otherwise, and how that actually shapes behaviour seems to me important. So a challenge for personalised medicine may be that knowing thyself cheaply fails to achieve the kind of cost reductions hoped for through prevention. And one factor affecting this outcome is whether risk is related to people's values sufficiently to encourage preventative behaviour change. If you really want to change people's behaviour, then it's likely to be mainly about people's values and beliefs, and only about communication of genetic risk as a kind of catalyst. And this brings me to the final point about self-knowledge and compassionate communion. Stratification according to risk offers an opportunity for deepened solidarity amidst risky human life. So I'm thinking here about the ethos of stratification, the psychological experience of being stratified with others according to a genetically defined understanding of a risk profile. Such an experience is an opportunity for self-knowledge, of knowing oneself as not being alone amidst the risks of life, of being joined together in therapeutic unity and hope with other persons, whether complete strangers or family members. Such unity in suffering can be profound, if perhaps disturbing, reflecting in Christian theological terms the strange way in which God participates in human suffering through the death and resurrection of Christ, thereby creating communities of solidarity. In theological terms, this is what's meant by communion. Then, even constrained by the risks genetically defined subgroups face, there can be a kind of freedom in fellowship amid suffering and potential suffering. And this sense of freedom is crucial to self-knowledge, that who I am and who we are is not finally determined by the risks we live with or the harms we may die from. Genetic solidarity groups formed in internet forums, for example, may or may not exhibit this kind of freedom. I'll be very interested to know what your experience of the ethos of stratification has been. because such an ethos of stratification, I think, gives moral shape to efforts to tailor healthcare for specific subpopulations. It provokes further questions. How do people's plural values and beliefs shape participation in such a community? How do these affect adherence, concordance questions, which have been raised earlier? Are there beneficial forms of psychological stratification on top of stratification according to genetic risk? And could these contribute towards motivating behaviour change, connecting risk perception with patient values? I think these are some of the kind of questions which we might be looking at in this project as we go along. It requires collaboration across humanities, social sciences and medical science disciplines. Now, of course, for some patients, behaviour change will have only a very small impact on their health. They need targeted therapies far more than a gym membership. My question here is, what does it say about us as a society that we're focused on these citizens with such passion and excellence when there are financial and opportunity costs to pursuing stratified medicine over against, say, public health initiatives focused on behaviour change? Well, here's how I see it up there. Stratified medicine offers newly precise kind of humanising healthcare through deliberate societal identification with the riskiest. I'll take a bit of the theological risk myself and say that in terms of the parable Jesus told, stratified medicine may reflect the work of the Good Shepherd who left the 99 behind in order to locate and bring back the sheep who was lost. Now, there are societal pitfalls here too. One German patient for whom a specific targeted therapy was not likely to work articulated precisely her fear of becoming a B patient. Stratified medicine may accentuate the different paths of suffering and death along which people journey. What and who is being lost along the way? And this patient's experience highlights the role, I think, of affections or emotions in risk communication, and thus the centrality of compassion. Compassion understands the feelings, as Sean pointed us towards, the affections of another person seeking to participate and alleviate. Compassionate clinicians need to be able to explore the right course of action in light of patient perceptions of risk and value in terms of cultural, religious, philosophical and everyday beliefs, but also, more challengingly perhaps, to be able to communicate the futility of treatment in some circumstances when the number of anyone's days comes into clearer focus. And this, I suggest, is the kind of compassionate communion which we all need. Thank you.